Imagine sitting in a windowless brick room.
Hmm.
You feel entirely secure.
Right, the security feels absolute in that kind of physical space.
Exactly. The walls are thick, the door is heavy, and you hold the only key. But over the course of 10 or 15 years, without making a single sound, those bricks molecularly shift into transparent glass.
And you never noticed the transition because you were already inside the room.
Yes, you were too busy looking out at the world. You didn't feel the exposure happening because the exposure was the very mechanism that allowed you to see out in the first place.
It is a profound shift, really.
It is. And today, we are looking at how the legal and structural walls of our privacy did exactly that. Welcome to this deep dive, where we are exploring the shift from privacy protection to digital participation.
And I think the most striking part of this entire transition is the absolute silence of it.
The silence is deafening when you look back. There was no singular moment of announcement, no public declaration, no line drawn in the sand.
And certainly no dramatic collapse of our legal frameworks.
Well,
The silence really is the defining characteristic of this shift.
So as we unpack this today, as we comb through the legal history and the structural realities of our current digital environment, we need to establish a baseline.
We do. And one thing becomes abundantly clear very quickly. There is no need for outrage, and there's no need for panic.
Right. To truly understand the system as it exists today, we have to look at it clinically.
Exactly. The system did not steal anything from you. It didn't break down the door of that brick room we just talked about. It simply and very quietly recorded what was freely released.
Which is a heavy thought. We're examining how the framework of privacy adapted and inverted, relying on the quiet premise that privacy dissolved not through force, but through agreement.
A dissolution by participation, essentially.
Right. But to understand how we arrived at a state of continuous exposure, where our devices map our routines, our preferences, and our physical locations, we have to understand what the original walls of that room are made of.
We have to map out the baseline of privacy in the United States.
Which means looking at the Fourth Amendment, but not just the text of it on the page. We need to look at a foundational legal concept established in a 1967 Supreme Court case called Katz v. United States.
Because Katz really anchored what privacy actually meant before the digital age took over.
Yes, it did. So, to appreciate Katz, I think we first have to understand what it replaced.
That is crucial context. Before 1967, the legal standard for privacy was largely governed by a concept of physical trespass.
Right, established in an older case called Olmstead.
Yes. In the Olmstead era, if the government wanted to listen to your phone calls, they just had to make sure they didn't physically break into your house to tap the line.
It was entirely physical. If they tapped the wires down the street on a public pole, the courts essentially said, well, they didn't trespass on your property, so your Fourth Amendment rights weren't violated.
Exactly. Privacy was tethered entirely to property lines. But Katz changed the fundamental architecture of that thinking?
Let's tell the story of Charles Katz because it perfectly illustrates this shift in logic.
It is a fascinating case study in how the law adapts to behavior.
Katz was a gambler. He operated one of the premier college basketball handicapping operations in the country, and he would use public payphones on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles to transmit gambling information to his associates.
And he specifically chose public payphones because he knew the FBI was on to him.
Right. He thought a public booth couldn't be tied to his personal property. He was relying on that Olmstead standard, basically.
He was. But the FBI simply walked up to the phone booth he used every day and attached a suction cup microphone to the outside of the glass.
They didn't break into the booth. They didn't tap the physical wire inside.
No, they just recorded the sound vibrations coming through the glass.
So in court, the FBI argued that because they never physically intruded into the booth and because the booth was a public space, they didn't violate his Fourth Amendment rights.
It was a very literal interpretation of the existing law. But the Supreme Court fundamentally disagreed.
And in doing so, they created the modern bedrock of privacy law.
They did. They ruled that the Fourth Amendment protects people, not places.
Protects people, not places. That is the critical pivot.
By stepping into that booth and pulling the door shut behind him, Charles Katz exhibited what the court called a reasonable expectation of privacy.
He intended for his words to remain private, and society recognized that intention as reasonable.
Exactly. That phrase, reasonable expectation of privacy, is the compass for everything we are going to discuss today.
It meant that privacy was a physical boundary that you actively maintained. A closed door, a sealed envelope, a locked filing cabinet.
It makes perfect sense when the world is made of atoms. When information is physically heavy, it requires effort to move.
Right. But here's the structural question we have to face. If the original legal boundary was so entirely dependent on physical, tangible reality, how did the courts even begin to map these protections onto invisible, weightless digital data?
It is a massive challenge. It sounds like trying to apply the rules of architecture to a cloud.
It really does. So what happened?
Well, the courts ran into an immediate friction point. The legal trajectory was not a sudden failure of the Constitution, but a deliberate recalibration.
They had to match legal doctrine to a shifting technological reality.
Precisely. If privacy was defined by what you kept strictly within your control, like cats shutting the phone booth door, the courts had to determine what happened when data, by its very nature, needed to leave your control in order to be useful.
So the transition didn't happen by rewriting the Constitution at all.
No. It happened by redefining who actually owns the information the precise moment it leaves your physical hands.
And that subtle redefinition is what brings us to the first major structural shift in our deep dive today.
This shift is anchored in what legal scholars call the third-party doctrine.
Right. To understand how the walls of our room turned to glass, we have to examine a 1979 case called Smith v. Maryland.
This is a foundational case and quite mundane in its details.
It is. Now, if you were listening to this, you might assume that the biggest blow to modern privacy came from some massive NSA data center or a Silicon Valley tech giant.
That is the common assumption, yes.
But legally speaking, it came from a very analog piece of technology called a pen register, used to catch a stalker in the late 1970s.
The facts of Smith v. Maryland are crucial here. A woman named Patricia McDonough was robbed.
And shortly after the robbery, she began receiving threatening, obscene phone calls from the man who robbed her, Michael Lee Smith.
The police had a suspicion it was him, but they needed proof. So without getting a warrant, they asked the telephone company to install a pen register at their central offices.
Let's pause and explain what a pen register is mechanically.
It is important to clarify because it is the dividing line between content and metadata.
Exactly. A pen register does not record the audio of a phone call. It doesn't hear the voices at all.
All it does is record the mechanical pulses or tones of the numbers being dialed. It just logs the destination.
So the police used this analog logging device to prove that Simish was dialing McDonough's number.
And Smith's lawyers predictively argued this was an illegal search. They argued he had a reasonable expectation of privacy in his own home when he dialed that phone.
But the Supreme Court rejected Smith's argument. And the logic they used really laid the groundwork for the modern digital panopticon.
They ruled that when you dial a number, you are voluntarily handing that specific piece of information, the sequence of digits, to the phone company.
You know, or you should reasonably know, that the phone company's switching equipment needs those numbers to route the call.
Exactly. You are turning over information to a third party to utilize a service.
And so the doctrine established a categorical exclusion. Individuals have no reasonable expectation of privacy for information voluntarily shared with third parties.
It is a clean legal severing of ownership.
Let's use an analogy here. It's like dropping a postcard into a public mailbox.
A very apt comparison.
You write a message on the back, you write an address on the front, and you drop it in the metal box on the corner. Once that postcard enters the physical infrastructure of the postal system, you cannot reasonably expect the postal workers not to look at the address.
They have to look at it to route it. The system requires that visibility to function.
Right. You voluntarily expose that outer layer of information to a third party. So the law says the government can look at the outside of that postcard too without a warrant because you already surrendered the boundary of privacy to the postal worker.
The postcard analogy perfectly captures the initial intent of the third-party doctrine. It reframed the concept of expectation entirely.
It removed the friction of constitutional protection by operating on a very simple assumption. Sharing is intentional.
Yes. The system concludes that nothing was seized from you. It was released by you.
If you hand your data to a bank, a phone company, or an internet service provider, you are making a deliberate choice.
And therefore, collection becomes legally permissible.
But, and this is a massive but, the postcard analogy only really holds up in the 1970s and 80s.
Right. It works when data is fragmented and sparse.
Exactly. It works when information is difficult to synthesize, when the police are just looking at one literal pen register tape for one specific suspect.
But if you fast forward a few decades, the technological reality shifted completely under our feet.
The courts suddenly realized they aren't dealing with a postal worker glancing at a single envelope anymore.
No, they're dealing with a supercomputer,
A supercomputer that has memorized every letter you have ever sent, every place you have ever stood, every search query you have ever typed, in real time.
The scale of collection altered the nature of the information itself. The legal framework was about to shatter under the weight of it.
Which means we need to look at what happens when the third-party doctrine meets the reality of modern computing power.
This introduces what legal scholars call the mosaic theory.
The power of aggregation.
Exactly. The mosaic theory deals with the transformation of isolated, seemingly meaningless data points into comprehensive, highly sensitive behavioral profiles.
The paradox of the mosaic theory is fascinating because it highlights how the sheer scale of the system bypasses traditional legal defenses entirely.
It really does. Because each individual piece of data you generate, your phone, pinging a cell tower, your search engine behavior, your credit card swipe at the pharmacy,
Each piece is legally accessible without a warrant under the third-party doctrine.
and each piece, on its own, is entirely harmless. A single location ping just means you were near a tower at 2 in the afternoon.
A single search query for a medical symptom means nothing in isolation. It's just a data point.
But the cascade of aggregation changes the fundamental nature of the data.
Right. When the system possesses the computational power to compile millions of these legally permissible, harmless data points, a metamorphosis occurs.
Movement becomes a pattern. Pattern becomes behavior. Behavior becomes prediction.
And the totality of the information reveals absolutely everything about you. Your political affiliations, your health conditions, your romantic associations, your daily routines.
And it builds this intensely intimate profile without a single constitutional violation ever taking place.
Because every single brick of that profile was voluntarily handed to a third party.
That is the quiet logic of the system.
Now, if you were listening to this, you might be thinking, well, eventually the courts had to step in and say, this has gone too far. They couldn't just let tech companies and the government track our every physical movement without a warrant.
And there was, in fact, a slight judicial acknowledgement of this overwhelming scale.
Right. In a 2018 Supreme Court case called Carpenter v. United States.
The Carpenter case is vital to understand, but its limitations are equally important.
Let's lay out the facts. Tim Carpenter was the ringleader of a group that committed a string of armed robberies at electronic stores across the Midwest.
To place Carpenter at the scene of these crimes, the FBI didn't use GPS trackers on his car.
No, they just went to his cell phone provider and requested his historical cell site location data.
Let's explain how cell site location information, or CSLI, actually works.
Because it illustrates the passive nature of modern data collection so well.
It does. Your smartphone is constantly, silently scanning its environment for the strongest signal.
Every few seconds, it reaches out to the nearest cell towers to say, I am here, are you there?
Right, just so it can route an incoming call or text if necessary. The telecom companies log these pings.
And because cell towers are everywhere, especially in urban areas, these logs create a highly precise time-stamped map of your physical movements.
In Carpenter's case, the government obtained 127 days of this location data.
That amounted to 12,898 specific location points.
It wasn't just a pen register showing dialed numbers. It was a comprehensive record of his physical existence for 4 months.
So Carpenter argued that gathering this much continuous location data without a warrant was a violation of the Fourth Amendment.
And the Supreme Court actually agreed with him, which surprised a lot of legal observers at the time.
Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, and he essentially acknowledged the mosaic theory, didn't he?
He did. He wrote that historical CSLI presents unique privacy concerns because tracking someone's physical movements continuously over a long period creates a deeply revealing map of a person's life.
He noted that cell phones have become an indispensable part of modern life. You can't just expect people to leave them at home.
The court carved out a narrow exception, requiring a warrant for historical cell site location data.
However, and this is the critical nuance we have to emphasize, they explicitly stated that they were not dismantling the broader third-party doctrine.
That is the key takeaway. They did not overturn the framework of voluntary exposure for bank records, internet metadata, or countless other digital footprints.
The overarching legal architecture remains completely intact. The system merely recalibrated slightly to account for the physical tracking aspect.
It was a very precise surgical adjustment, not a demolition.
Which leads to a massive structural challenge to this legal logic. If we accept the mosaic theory, if we accept that a collection of legally permissible, harmless dots can cross an invisible line into a constitutionally sensitive pattern.
How do we draw the line?
Exactly. If every single brick used to build this profile is legally obtained, how can the house they build suddenly be considered a violation?
Structurally, the legal system's recognition of the mosaic theory in Carpenter did not halt the expansion of surveillance.
It merely legitimized it under controlled conditions.
The fundamental premise remains. If the initial collection of the data point is permissible because you voluntarily exposed it, the subsequent analysis of that data is inevitable.
The system was permitted to collect the bricks, so it built the house.
Precisely.
So if this aggregated mosaic is so deeply revealing, if it exposes our most intimate details simply by analyzing the digital exhaust of our daily lives, it forces a very difficult question.
Why did we keep handing over the pieces?
Right. Why did we continue to supply the bricks? The answer lies in how the very concept of consent was quietly redesigned.
This is perhaps the most crucial psychological shift in the entire process.
The transition from intentional sharing to conditioned procedural compliance.
Remember, the third-party doctrine fundamentally relies on the assumption of awareness.
When you handed a sealed envelope to a postal worker in 1970 or dialed a rotary phone in 1979, the courts assumed you made a deliberate, conscious choice to expose that outer layer of information.
But let's look at the actual mechanics of modern digital participation.
We are talking about terms of service agreements, opt-in prompts, mandatory checkboxes, and account logins.
We have all experienced the absurdity of a tech company updating its software.
A screen pops up with a 300-page legal document written in impenetrable corporate legalese.
Reading a single major iOS update agreement would take hours, and frankly, a law degree to fully comprehend.
Modern consent in the digital panopticon is not a deliberate, thoughtful weighing of privacy against convenience. It doesn't feel like a decision at all.
You don't evaluate the terms. You simply scroll to the bottom and click Agree because you need your phone to turn back on.
You need to text your family or use your maps to get home.
The system operates with remarkable efficiency here because you do not choose to share. You comply to participate.
You comply to participate. That is the core of it. You need the banking app to manage your finances. You need the communication platform to do your job.
You need the navigation system to travel. The psychological shift is profound.
Through sheer repetition, you click accept so many times just to function in modern society that you eventually stop seeing the warning signs entirely.
Procedural compliance replaces intentional consent.
Checkboxes effectively replaced warrants, and the absolute necessity of access replaced the intrusion of a physical search.
It is the exact difference between negotiating a legally binding contract with an attorney present versus walking through an automatic sliding door at a grocery store.
I love that analogy. Let's explore that. When you walk up to that sliding door, you don't stop, inspect the motion sensor, and read the terms and conditions of the infrared beam reading your physical presence.
You don't consciously weigh the privacy implications of the store knowing you entered at 4:12 p.m.
You just need to get inside the building to buy your food and live your life.
The door demands your physical presence to open, and you provide it without a second thought.
The profound implication of that sliding door analogy is that the system of continuous exposure moved forward not by defeating our resistance, but by relying entirely on our participation.
This system didn't have to convince you to give up your privacy. It only needed you to continue walking through the doors.
You never explicitly, consciously agreed to be understood this completely by a network of algorithms.
But your consent was implied by your continued daily presence within the system.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, I understand they have my data. I understand I clicked agree. But what are they actually doing with it?
That is the ultimate question. Because you kept walking through those automatic doors day after day, year after year, the system gathered enough data to cross a critical threshold.
It reached a point where it stopped merely recording your past actions.
It possessed enough pieces of the mosaic that it began calculating your future.
Which is chilling, but logically sound. We have arrived at the current reality of the architecture, the evolution from reactive surveillance to anticipatory modeling.
There will be no future moment where surveillance arrives, because it already did.
The mosaic theory, the gathering of all those historical data points, was never the end point.
It was merely the transition. It was the bridge from observation to anticipation.
Let's explain how this anticipatory modeling actually functions. It isn't magic. It is pure statistics.
Every single digital interaction you make feeds a model.
How long you hover your thumb over a specific social media post before scrolling past it.
The exact geolocation where your phone connects to Wi-Fi every evening.
The microscopic variations in your typing speed.
These aren't just isolated records. They are algorithmic training weights.
Every pattern you establish refines the model.
Over time, as your habits stabilize and the predictions improve, your data begins to reflect you more clearly than you might even reflect yourself.
This leads to a stark realization about the nature of our current environment. The system no longer needs your consent in the way it used to.
Because it no longer needs new information from you to understand you.
It has collected enough historical patterns, enough behavioral exhaust, to simulate your outcomes without waiting for you to act.
The third-party doctrine removed the friction of collection, allowing the data to flow freely.
And once enough of that data accumulated in server farms, the nature of surveillance fundamentally changed.
Let's recontextualize the Fourth Amendment based on this predictive reality.
The framework of the Fourth Amendment didn't fail. It wasn't abolished by a tyrannical government.
It simply became less relevant because the system now operates completely ahead of it.
The Fourth Amendment protects you from an unreasonable search of your present self, your present property.
It stops the police from breaking down your door right now to see what is inside.
But the system doesn't need to search your present if it already has the computational power to predict your future.
It isn't reactive anymore. It is anticipatory.
The system evolved into something that no longer requires permission to understand you.
It does not need to intrude upon your physical space to know what you were doing, because it already knows what you were statistically guaranteed to do based on the sum of all your observable behavior.
The models can accurately predict when a user is likely to become pregnant, when they are likely to quit their job, or when they are susceptible to a specific emotional trigger.
Purely based on shifts in purchasing patterns, metadata, and search histories.
Wait, but think about the philosophical implications of that for a second.
They are profound.
If the mosaic theory isn't just describing a method of surveillance, but is actually mirroring identity formation itself, are we no longer defined by our isolated conscious choices?
Are we now defined strictly by the sum of our observable behaviors as interpreted by a predictive model?
From the perspective of the system, the answer is yes.
Surveillance is no longer an action taken against you. It is structurally integrated into the environment you inhabit.
It is a machine that anticipates.
You are not being watched in the traditional sense of a camera tracking your movements.
You are being modeled.
And the model operates continuously, silently, and with an accuracy born of your own implied procedural consent.
Which brings us to the final reality of the digital panopticon, a reality that requires no dramatics, no emotional spikes, and no panic.
It only requires a quiet, intellectual acceptance of the structure that we, through our daily participation, helped build.
We are bringing this deep dive to a point of absolute stillness.
We must restate the core thesis, stripping away any hype or hyperbole.
The framework of privacy did not collapse. It adapted to the technological environment.
And the shift from protection to continuous exposure didn't happen to you. It happened with you.
Privacy was never a right you could passively assume would just surround you like the air you breathe.
It was always a physical boundary. It was a door you had to keep closed, a lock you had to turn.
It was a boundary you had to actively maintain. And the quiet truth is that most people stopped maintaining it incrementally without resistance.
Because the convenience of access was too deeply intertwined with modern life.
You wanted the GPS to show you the fastest route home, so you surrendered the location data.
You wanted the convenience of the sliding door.
The concept of the lone wolf in this surveillance pack is simply the individual who understands this architecture clearly, without illusion.
The lone wolf understands that there is no betrayal here. Nothing was stolen.
We extended ourselves into systems that do not operate under our authority.
We chose to exist in an environment where recording is constant.
And by doing so, we provided the raw material, the data, that allows the system to predict our next move.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to consider as you go about your day.
A question that builds on the predictive nature of the systems we have so seamlessly integrated into our lives.
If the architecture of surveillance has evolved past the point of needing your new data to simulate your outcomes,
if it already knows what you are statistically likely to do before you even realize you're going to do it,
we must ask ourselves,
at what point does the system stop merely predicting the choices you will make and begin subtly conditioning the choices you believe are yours?